So, hey guys, welcome to another movie review. Today I'm talking about a film that I can honestly say I've been meaning to watch for several years. I just haven't got around to watching it. And obviously, with the pandemic still happening, and me kind of just catching up on films that I've heard about over the years that I just never got around to seeing. This is actually a film that's based off of a book that I really liked when I was younger. I think I read this book when I was like 12 or 13 years old, roughly. And that's the film A Cry in the Wild. But for those who are kind of thrown off by the book that I read when I was younger, this is actually based off the book Hatchet by Gary Paulson. Um, so that's a book that I read when I was younger that I really, really enjoyed. And I've always heard from people that there was a movie and that they didn't call it Hatchet so that people didn't think it was a horror film, but they did rename it to A Cry in the Wild. So that's why this film is based off of a book. They just changed the title to hopefully market the film a little bit better. So I really liked that Hatchet book when I was younger. It really was a neat little survival story novel that I remember really being intrigued by, and I think the author himself said there was certain things about it that he based off of like a camping trip. Like if he really only had a couple of resources available to him, how would he survive out in the wilderness? And it's just a really interesting novel that was a very fun read back in the day. And I've been looking for A Cry in the Wild forever, and unfortunately, it took me all the way to buy it on Amazon just to be able to track down a copy of it. This actually is a Region Zero disc, so who knows if that means it's region free or not. So um, it took me until 2021 to actually sit down and watch this movie finally. So I'm here to review it for you and see if it's worth your time. If you, for those who did read Hatchet as well and never got around to seeing the movie. So, in A Cry in the Wild, guys, if you don't even know what Hatchet is, or if you haven't heard of A Cry in the Wild at all, this is actually a Roger Corman produced movie, so it's very, very low budget. But the movie itself and the story itself is about a young man who has parents who are divorced, and he is about to spend his summer with his father. And what's kind of more different than usual as far as a parent and their child meeting up somewhere is he actually has his own little private plane to go and see his father. So this private pilot person is going to go fly him to where his dad is, and that way he can kind of spend the summer with him and things like that. But unfortunately for Brian, which is the name of this boy, the pilot has a heart attack while flying this plane and crashes the plane. And so basically, he's left out in the wilderness. The plane is in the water. Clearly, the pilot is dead at this point. And now, this boy with nothing but a hatchet on his pocket and maybe a pack of gum and a couple of other things has to survive out in the wilderness until somebody eventually finds him out there. And so, that's also the plot of the novel as well. And there's certain things that he really has to kind of just suck it up and go with it. And that's things like food and where to sleep and what to do when an animal steals your food in the middle of the night, and things like what to do when you have an injury, and what to do when you're thirsty and you need to find something to drink, and what to do when the weather is bad outside. So all these things happen over the course of A Cry in the Wild, and so this young man has to figure out what exactly he's going to do when those things happen. And so there's things like when he's getting hungry and he really doesn't have a lot of food available to him, how sometimes digging worms out of the ground or digging maggots out of a rock or digging maggots out of a piece of wood. Something like that just to kind of keep you alive in the wilderness until somebody finds you, that you have to go through just to be able to stay alive. Things like drinking out of the lake, even though it's probably extremely dirty to drink from. What to do when a raccoon steals all your berries in the middle of the night, what to do when a porcupine attacks you and you have these little needles stuck in your leg now and you got to dig it out and you don't have any band-aids on you or anything. So A Cry in the Wild basically is that. It's this young man surviving out in the wilderness until somebody is able to find him out in the wilderness. So overall, guys, for the Cry in the Wild movie, not the book, so I'm reviewing A Cry in the Wild, the movie, I think the movie was okay. Unfortunately, the book is a lot better. I remember the book being much more investing when I read that as a young man. So, A Cry in the Wild, I'm going to talk about kind of things in it that I really liked, but some things about that I really didn't like. So, for the positives of A Cry in the Wild, the film does depict kind of what to do when you're in survival mode and some things you have to go through for severe survival methods to be able to stay alive. Like eating the worms, eating the maggots, eating the wild berries, drinking from the lake, what to do when a storm happens and kind of knocks all the wood off of your little wood fortress and you kind of have to rebuild it to be able to sleep somewhere for that night. What to do when the bugs attack you, what to do when the mosquitoes attack you. So, all those things I thought were very well handled in this movie. It really does depict just what you would have to go through if you were in this young man's position and what you would have to do just to survive that situation. And so I thought the film did a great job of showing what to do with the severity of a situation like this. And for the most part, the film does follow the Hatchet story for the most part pretty well. I would say a lot of the things I remember from the book are pretty much here in this movie. I did hear from a special feature I watched on this disc of this movie that, and obviously it's been years since I read the book, so I'm sure if there's very specific details from the book that I'm missing out here or the film missed out on, obviously I probably wouldn't have been able to catch on that. But apparently they used a bear instead of a moose. I guess in the book they used like a moose of some kind. So in the movie they used a bear instead, which it's basically just showing the point that you're going to encounter animals out in the forest, and some of them are going to want your food and things like that. So that's really what A Cry in the Wild was depicting in those moments, where like, oh, they didn't use a moose instead of a bear and all that kind of stuff. So, but for the most part, they followed the book really well. There's just certain aspect of the story where they had to use like a bear instead of a moose just to be able to, I'm sure, deal with budget and all that other stuff. And yeah, for the most part, I thought they followed the book pretty well. Cry in the Wild also has some pretty decent acting in it. There's a lot of scenes where Jared Rushton, who is in Big and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, who plays Brian in this, apparently must have ate real worms or something, because they didn't share in the special features what he did as far as, you know, eating fake worms go and stuff. So I'm assuming either they were real worms or really convincing looking gummy worms that look like real worms. And so there's things like that where they probably had to go through a lot just to make this film work. So there's some decent acting in it. Ned Beatty plays the private pilot in this plane that crashes and things like that. So, you know, acting-wise, it's fine. But when I get to my negatives, though, there's some other aspects of A Cry in the Wild that don't work out as well, unfortunately. The use of trained animals I thought was really good here, whether it's the raccoon just crossing Brian to get to his berries, or the porcupine poking Brian to use as a defense mechanism, or the bear that was in the lake with him that he had to fight off to make sure he could like, get his fish for dinner and things like that. So apparently they did use some real trained animals for this movie, so that was kind of cool. And apparently they didn't harm any of them at the making of this movie, which I saw in the end credits, which is always good, because when you hear about trained animals, you almost kind of wonder what they had to go through to get them to do the things that they needed to do for this movie. So the trained animals I thought were really well handled in this movie. And another positive I have for Cry in the Wild is you really do feel sorry for this kid. There's just a lot of moments where you can tell the kid is really suffering and really doesn't know what to do. And is looking for any way possible to be able to survive this really terrible situation. And you just feel really sorry for the guy. For my negatives, though, for A Cry in the Wild, all the times where the kid is kind of in this dangerous situation out in the wild, it does feel kind of episodic, whether it's the mosquitoes attacking him or the bees attacking him, or the bear kind of beating him to the lake to get the fish and things like that. It just feels very episodic. They just kind of play around with it for a couple minutes and then they just kind of move on to the next scene or fade to black and move on to the next idea. So in that regard, the film does feel really episodic, while the book really kind of plays into the scenarios really well. Some of the nature dangers that this character faces in this movie just feel a little too episodic for me. They're just kind of very matter of fact. You can also tell this film is very low budget because of the use of like bug sound when he's attacked by mosquitoes, or the use of bees when they're like flying around him and things like that. There's also some quick cut edits as far as like him learning how to make fire, where one moment the straw isn't on fire and the next second it is on fire and things like that, where they do little cheap little edits so that the actor on set didn't have to worry about actually making the fire himself and things like that. So certain aspects of the film were very low budget to me, and it does kind of show in this film a little bit. And some of the solutions that the Brian character faces are very glossed over as far as solutions go. It's like when the porcupine puts needles into his foot or into his leg, it literally is like a 2-minute scene of him like trying to get the needles out, and then they just kind of move on to the next thing. So I think there's certain parts like that where it's like, okay, I don't think that would have been as clean of a getaway in real life as the film would have depicted that as. So certain solutions here do feel a little glossed over, and that's kind of too bad, unfortunately. There's also a lot of flashbacks in this movie, and for me personally, I thought they were pretty worthless. Yeah, it's cool to see maybe more of Brian's background and things like that, and kind of how bad of a life he had in certain times of his life, but some of them, for the most part, feel pretty useless. And some of the information I really kind of don't need. Like, I really don't need to know about this guy that his mom moved on to after she divorced the dad. I don't need to know about a bad injury he had on his hand at one point. It really doesn't add anything to the movie. Sure, it's cool if it's in the book and you want to put it into the movie, but as a result, you have to find a reason for why it exists in the movie. It has to have a context as to why you're translating something from the book into the film and what's useful about it. So there's certain aspects like that in the movie where you just kind of sit down and sit back and be like, well, why do they have to show me that? But overall, guys, A Cry in the Wild, I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. I think there's okay things about it. It is a Roger Corman produced movie, so go into it knowing that it's not going to have great production qualities because they probably had to rush this out the door at some point, given that a lot of his films are kind of really quickly made. Um, but as far as being like a fan of the Hatchet novel goes, it's not a bad little find. There's definitely it definitely couldn't have been way worse than how it turned out. But for the most part, for my money, I thought it was okay. I certainly would have preferred to like watch this on Netflix or something where I didn't have to go all the way to Amazon and buy a copy of this film myself just to see it. But 7.5 out of 10 for me. If you like the Hatchet novel, it's not a bad little find. But if you haven't heard of Hatchet or don't really care about this story, you can probably skip this one. 7.5 out of 10 for me. I moderately recommend A Cry in the Wild.